flipping the table.
This is the second in our Imhoff Archives series featuring conversations between author and activist Dan Imhoff and pioneers in the sustainable agriculture movement. These conversations were recorded in the first decade of the 2000s when Dan hosted the Farm and Garden Show for public radio in Mendocino County, California. In today's episode, Dan engages Eliot Coleman, the Maine-based wild gardener, author, and evangelist who helped inspire the nation's organic farming movement. Eliot is the author of several books and articles used by people around the world to grow healthy food without the use of chemicals. Surprisingly, Eliot worked with the USDA back in 1979 on its landmark study, Report and Recommendations on Organic Farming, which was the beginning of that giant bureaucracy's recognition of what many now see as central to agriculture's future. Eliot has been farming for 50 years, and as Dan said in our podcast introducing this series back in October, he was struck by Eliot's commitment to learn from growers around the world and to adapt what he learned to his four-season farm in Harborside, Maine. And from their conversation, I learned a lot about plants, Eliot's journey and early connection to pioneering homesteaders Scott and Helen Nearing, and his elegant farming craft. And I know that if you have an interest in organic produce, the needs of plants, and the philosophy of working with nature rather than against her to grow food, you will enjoy this conversation between Dan Imhoff and Eliot Coleman.
Imhoff Archives.
That's Eliot. And Dan, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey, we did it. Okay. Thank you, staff. We're pulling this off rather nice. Now, in lieu of that introduction, what shall we start with, Dan? You worked harder on this one than I did, and you had a nice long talk with Eliot last week.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks, Eliot, for pinch hitting here at the last minute.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. Well, I felt, just as we said in the introduction, that given that organic as a system and as a regulated commercial industry is now coming under the under the USDA, I thought it would be very interesting to spend an hour talking with someone who knows pretty well what exactly are the origins of organic farming, and why did it come about? Why did people all of a sudden really feel? At what point did they feel that it was important to keep agriculture and nature aligned rather than trying to turn it into some industrial system? And I know I've been to Eliot's farm and seen his study. I know he's collected as much as he possibly can on the history of the movement, and so actually it's not really a pinch hit at all. I think this is a great fit. So I guess I'd like to start it out. Eliot, you said that you felt organic farming was a revolutionary philosophy, and I'm just wondering why you thought such.
Oh boy, a revolutionary philosophy. Yeah, I mean it undermines all the thinking that goes on not only in agriculture but in other parts of our society. The good organic farmer is out there trying to correct the causes of problems rather than treat the symptoms of problems. Mm-hmm. And throughout our society, I think we have a passion for treating symptoms rather than correcting causes. I'll give you a good example of that. That's the way we treat all pest problems on this farm. We don't use any of even the supposedly, quote, safe, unquote, organic pesticides, because our assumption is that if our plants are sick enough so that pests and diseases are bothering them, that our role as farmers is to figure out how to make them vigorous and resistant. rather than just mask the situation by trying to remove the visible indications that all is not well, i.e. the pest or the disease.
I don't think many people are aware of how long ago, really, industrial agriculture started. And I know that Liebig, who gave us the NPK reductionist theory of inputs, how much fertility was needed in the soil, that began in the 1850s. How far back have you traced, really, the organic movement?
Well, yeah, I guess you'd probably say it began with Liebig's theory. The interesting thing is theorists never change history. They merely present ideas, and someone who takes that idea and turns it into an economic concept are usually the ones who change history. The people who did that were two gentlemen named Laws and Gilbert, Britishers, who worked together and decided that, hey, we can turn this idea into something economic that we can sell. And so they were putting out the first early superphosphates by treating bones with acid, putting out some of the earliest nitrate fertilizers. And that was what started the movement going, because all of a sudden farmers were now it was now being suggested to farmers that they should buy things that they had already always gotten in a simpler form. For example, they'd gotten their nitrogen from growing legumes, and now it was being sold to them. Mm-hmm. They had used bone meal before, but they'd never thought that it was necessary to put it in a soluble form before using it. Well, it turns out that it isn't, but that was sure a hot way to sell it.
Right, and their initial experiments with these turned out pretty favorable with these products sometimes.
Oh yeah, you
like
take
guano or some kind of sulfuric acid, nitrogen, or potassium.
Yeah. I mean, Dan, you take any good organic farm and with plenty of organic matter in the soil, and you add a little soluble nitrogen at certain points in the year, and you're going to see a response from it. Now, the response you're only going to see, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of yield. What you're going to see is a response that's negative in terms of quality because you're pushing the crop artificially. Mm-hmm. But I don't think early growers were aware of that. They saw a supposed advantage in terms of yield and bought into the system. It's only recently that people have started thinking in terms of quality and realizing that you don't get one thing without losing something else. And if you put in soluble nitrogen early in the spring and you boost crops along, well, that seems neat. But recent research is showing that at the same time, plants aren't picking up, say, the amount of zinc they should pick up. So you may be getting bulk, but you're getting bulk without quality.
So we're looking at some scientific evidence, too, then, that, these aren't as nutritious for you. And that's been kind of people been unable to sort of prove those kind of things. They keep saying, but that's good. That's good news.
But again, I don't want to claim that this proves anything scientifically. What I mentioned is based on scientific studies, but I'm sure the scientist is going to say, however, we have no proof that that small amount of zinc you're missing is at all detrimental to you. Science can prove almost anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, science could tell you that jumping off the roof of the building you're in out there is there's no proof that it will kill you, and that's mainly because no one has jumped off the roof of that building and died. But you can use science for all sorts of devious means.
Oh yeah, they have.
You traced organic writing back to, well, not the term organic, but one of the main concepts that all insects aren't necessarily bad, back to a guy named Forbes in the 1870s.
Yes, S.A. Forbes was the head of a wonderful little organization in Illinois back then called the Illinois State Laboratory of Natural History. And he was writing some stuff which, my gosh, when I first read that some 20 years ago, I was just stunned that it was written in the 1870s. I mean, it was, to me, a totally modern approach, and it seems that that approach existed. And then as the weapons of agriculture, the pesticides became more developed, it was lost. Human beings seem to have a love of weapons and enemies, and Forbes was suggesting that there weren't enemies out there. There was a misunderstanding of the natural world. But his ideas seem to have been subsumed by the passion for the weapons when they arrived. There were other writers. There was a wonderful book written in about 1898, originally in England, called Agricultural Changes, by a man named Robert Eliot. And he was suggesting that in order to have a really fertile soil, you had to grow all sorts of wonderful green manures and with different plants in them that people had put in before. He was the one suggesting you wanted chicories and other deep-rooting plants, and that when you turned those under after they'd been used as pasture or hayfield, you had accumulated a lot of fertility which you could use. And this book created quite a stir at the time. It was reprinted a number of times.
There's quite a famous case in California of the Vidalia beetle. Biological control happened around that time, where the California citrus industry was just getting going. And as I understand it, they suddenly got an attack of this scale called the cottony cushion scale. And they got together at one of their conventions, their annual conventions, and someone from the USDA mentioned, well, you know, there was an idea that it came from Australia. Why don't you guys just scrape together enough money to send somebody over there to find out what naturally contains that cottony cushion scale in Australia? And the guy came back with a couple dozen beetles, and it just turned out that they devoured the cottony cushion scale. And simply by bringing over a stick and getting a bunch of beetles and taking them back to their orchards, the California citrus growers were able to prevent a disaster. And that carried through until about the 40s, when they started to spray DDT, and then they wiped out the Vidalia beetle, which was the natural control for the cottony cushion scale. And I think that's talked about in Silent Spring. But there was this idea that all bugs weren't bad, and you were trying to develop a balance pretty early on.
Yes. You know, Dan, if I could give an overall picture to this, I think it might be nice at this point. Mm-hmm. We've mentioned a lot of good ideas. We mentioned the idea that green manures, especially those containing legumes, take nitrogen from the air, that the soil itself has the power to make the phosphorus in bone meal available if you treat it correctly, that there are simple ways of managing insects. And yet, despite the existence and reasonable scientific knowledge of these things, the ideas have never taken hold as one would hope they would. The ideas that have taken hold seem to be, instead of ideas that the farmer can do for him or herself, are ideas that are sold by an industrial concern to the farmer. And it seems that farmers are looking for new solutions, but have never really had as much faith as they should have in the fact that since they're doing this every day, they have a pretty good idea what those new solutions might be and where they are. The problem is that out in the other world and with huge advertising budgets are the industrial combines trying to sell them products that will supposedly solve these problems. And boy, there's no advertising being done between farmers saying, oh, hey, let me tell you what I did last year. It sure seemed to work. They're all susceptible to the advertising for these supposed miracle helpers. And that's what seems to have done in all these good ideas. There has never been a branch of the USDA, unfortunately, that was devoted to helping farmers keep the money in their pockets.
Not that I've ever heard of.
But rather suggesting to them that they needed this or that wonderful new miracle product made by industry.
And a lot of the early regulations were actually just to, instead of protecting the health of people, it was just to make sure that if you said it was such and such a percentage of arsenic, that it actually contained it.
Yes. Yeah.
It was really truth in advertising.
Absolutely.
Rather than any kind of protection or more sane system.
And why this comes about, I think it's probably maybe our school system is failing in not introducing children at a young age to the wonders of the natural world and impressing upon them how incredibly beautiful that system is and how effectively it works. If that were in the back of people's minds, they would find it so much easier to understand that the intelligent farmer working with the natural world can achieve all the goals that everybody is after without compromising quality. That, maybe by using nitrogen fertilizers, which are basically a drug, you can get your plants on a drug high. But that's no better for your plants or the people consuming them than it is for the drug addict.
Well, in correlation to that, then I'd say this new federal law is another little hit at the dumbing down of farmers. They don't want us making any decisions about our organizations. They don't want us sitting on our own boards for, say, doing certification work. So, it all fits the same scenario. It's been going on for some time.
Yeah, when this whole thing started back in the late 80s, the idea that the USDA would certify organics, I remember suggesting to some of the people who were about to go to all the meetings and give away the farm that there was a better way to go about this, and it was the way I had seen in Europe back in the 70s. And when I first started going over and visiting small farms there were about 6 different organic type groups in Europe, but they all had different standards. And each of them sold food with their label on it, with a note nearby posting what their standards were. And some of them were stricter than others. The strictest at the time, I suppose, was the biodynamic. But there was also different groups in France, like Nature Progrès. There was a Swiss group, Bioorganic. And what this meant was that the European consumer had a choice. If the less strict groups charged a commensurate price, their stuff might have been a little less expensive than the stricter groups. But say new research came out that some input being used by organic farmers generally turned out not to be good for you. All of a sudden, the consumers then could sit there and look at the different standards and say, oh, look, groups B and D aren't using that. We're going to buy from them. Right. Well, all of a sudden, groups A, C, and E had to shape up their systems because the consumers had just decided they didn't want that in their food. And this was a marvelous system. It gave the consumers the power to improve the quality of their food ever upward.
Yeah.
The minute you have a single standard, as we're getting now, what you have is the ability for bureaucrats, as they will, to cheapen that standard. A friend defined what he sees as coming in the future as something he called neo-conventional, as the organic of the future. I thought it was a wonderful term, and I'm afraid that's where we're going.
Yeah. And I have a few things to say about that. You had mentioned in our previous conversation that in 1938, actually, under Henry Wallace, the USDA put out a yearbook of agriculture that we'd probably be shocked to see today. And in addition to that, up to this time, it seems that one of the premises that the organic movement has been based on, which is pretty revolutionary, is the free flowing of information, farmer to farmer, and without patents, which is blatantly the way conventional agriculture is going with genetically modified crops, where
Absolutely.
every single discovery has to be patented and corporately owned. It didn't always used to be that way, though, in the USDA.
No, and if the listeners are interested, the book, the 1938 Yearbook of Agriculture, was called Soils and Men.
Yep.
And it really is a marvelous volume. In fact, I've often said you could take most of that and reprint it today, and people would think it had just been written. I mean, that's how an influential person like Henry Wallace, with good ideas and ideas that were in favor of farmers rather than the people selling things to farmers, that's how influential someone like that can be on the USDA in getting them to put out the type of information that farmers would like to have. Unfortunately, that has not always been the case.
How popular was that book? And, I mean, did it have an impact at the time?
That's a good question. I mean, people like Louis Bromfield, who were sort of the leaders of some form of more or less organics during the 50s, I know were aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the people who wrote articles in there were involved in Bromfield's Friends of the Land and the other organizations that came out of the Soil Conservation Service at that time. In fact, one of the main supporters of Bromfield and his group was a gentleman, I forget his first name, named Bennett, Hugh Bennett, I think, who was the head of the Soil Conservation Service. I mean, I can't imagine the head of the Soil Conservation Service now being closely involved with a leading organic organization, but that was the operation back then.
Wow.
When is the first time that you have found someone used the word organic to describe farming?
Well, in all the old books I have on my shelf, the old English books where it happens first, there were a couple of writers back in the late 30s, 1938, 1939, in a couple of books, Look to the Land by Lord Northbourne and, let's see, what were the others? Lord Portsmouth, Alternative to Death. Boy, that was a heavy title, wasn't it? And it's one or the other of these, and it's hard to tell because they both use the word at some point in one of their early volumes. The first time I have seen the use of the word organic referring to the farming system. And whether that is true or not, I remember back in 1976, I was fortunate to meet Lady Eve Balfour, who was involved in England in the early years of that, a friend of Sir Albert Howard and all of that. And I asked her whether she knew who had first used it, and she thought for a time and said no. It was an interesting question, but that it had just sort of appeared, and she was never sure who the first person to apply it to the type of farming that we do today was, but that she didn't think it was the best word. She much preferred the term biological agriculture to describe the concept.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, then it seems after Sir Albert Howard really wrote some of the definitive early works in Agricultural Testament, which I've been reading in preparation for this radio show, and I'm pretty amazed by how technical and thorough Howard was in describing things like soil mycelium. He was really on to that, as well as many sophisticated uses of humus and feeding the soil, and even shade-grown coffee and tea he has, or shade-grown tea plantations he has, as a superior system. It was Rodale, perhaps, J.R. Rodale, who helped in this country to establish organic as an alternative.
Yes, absolutely. J.I. Rodale was an electronics manufacturer in Pennsylvania who read Howard's work, an agricultural testament, I believe, and immediately it said, wow, that's what interests me. That's the way I think we need to do something about this. And that was the start of Organic Gardening magazine. And there was actually at the very start an organic farming magazine, which was separate from it. But I think that lasted about, 3 or 4 issues before J.I. Rodale realized that he was better off with gardeners, because that one was selling. Uh-huh. And he put the two together, and for up until, I think, 15 years ago, it was known as Organic Gardening and Farming.
Yeah, I was subscribing back then.
Excuse me?
Yeah, I was subscribing back then when it was still called that. Yeah. Okay, Bob, I'm a loss for a second here.
Okay. Well, now I think you are on a piece of land that used to be owned by Helen and Scott Nearing.
That's correct.
Oh, yeah. And they also played a role, I think, in the popularizing, at least inspiring people to get back to the land and talking a lot about organic gardening and double digging and things like that.
Oh, absolutely, Dan. I mean, they were my inspiration. I had never heard of the ideas before I read Living the Good Life, and I think that's true of an awful lot of the children of the 60s who found their introduction to a lot of good ideas through reading Scott and Helen's book. And the wonderful thing about them was not only did they write about it, but they practiced it so well. When I first drove over to visit them, they were living in Maine by then. That was 1965 or 6. They had built a stone wall around their garden, and it was the most impeccable garden I could imagine. I mean, Scott was an exceptional organic grower. He always made tons of compost. I mean, he was so organized. Just knowing the man was enough to improve your gardening skills, much less knowing what he did.
And he was probably in his 60s or 70s by then.
When I met Scott, he was 80.
Wow.
85, I would say. Yeah.
Holy cow.
And I mean, one of my favorite stories is one day I was over helping him get some cedar logs out of the woods for a new woodshed he was building. And it was the end of the day. It had been a long day. I was tired, and I said to myself, wait a minute, Eliot, straighten up, boy. There's an 85-year-old man under the other end of this log. He was tough. He was great to work with. Both of them were. Helen was wonderful.
And
also,
did they grow a fair amount of their own food?
They grew practically everything they ate. They were as faithful to the ideas in their book as anyone I can imagine. And they stored it well in a root cellar. They were the ones who first inspired me to look beyond the normal confines of the growing season, because they had a lean-to greenhouse up against the stone wall in one corner of their garden. And they weren't pushing the season like we do now, but they could eat out of that, well on into December, and then they used to go off on their lecture tour, but they would leave it filled with small lettuces and small Swiss chard transplants that they'd put in. And young plants like that are very hardy, and would winter over nicely, and when the Nearings returned in March, all of a sudden they had a greenhouse full of food to eat.
I remember being out at the farm, and you mentioned one time that actually, though, over time, the fertility in some of their beds started to decline.
Well, yeah, that was something, Dan, that I noticed over the years in a number of old organic gardens, and I used to call it the old organic garden syndrome. And I had a hunch what it was, but it was really hard to pin it down. And, at one point I suggested to Helen that she spread a lot of really acid peat moss in there, because I thought she'd gotten the pH up too high, and that seemed to help. I got a soil test done for her, and I found out she'd been using a lot of wood ashes. So not only was the potassium excessively high, but the pH was high, which is one of the reasons I was suggesting the acid peat moss. There seemed to be a lot of reasons. I had a feeling maybe calcium was getting tied up in some way. Eventually, Scott pulled it back out, and he did it because he dug the garden deeper than he had before, and that probably brought up some new soil, and maybe things worked better. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a curiosity, and it's something that, we're on the same soil now for 35 years, and we aren't seeing it yet, so obviously we're still doing something right, hopefully.
Can people come visit that farm?
Yes, the Nearing's Place is now the Good Life Center, and there are caretakers there who run the garden and who give people tours. It's really wonderful it's done like that, because there are an awful lot of people who, having read that book, would sort of like to come and touch the Blarney Stone and see that it actually existed. One wonderful thing about talking to Scott and Helen was they had been in the game long enough that they knew a lot of the old timers, and if you go back through the history of organic farming in the U.S., there are a lot of very influential people who have sort of, you hardly hear about them anymore. Maybe they wrote a book, but they never, made a real statement like Scott and Helen. But, I have a book here by Beatrice Trum Hunter, Gardening Without Poisons. And it's subtitled A Constructive Answer to the Pesticide Problem. And this one came out in, 1964, same year as Silent Spring. Beatrice Trum Hunter was an old friend of theirs. This is a wonderful book. This was really exceptional. And Scott supposedly was the one who taught Ruth Stout, the woman who popularized the mulch system in her books, supposedly the one who taught her to garden. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating, the connections between people and ideas, and how ideas flow, and from whom they flowed originally. Who was the person way back then who we would give credit to all of this to? Probably the very first gardener, I guess. If you're a good gardener, you pay attention. If you pay attention, you realize how effective the natural world is at doing what you need it to do.
Okay, I need to say that this is KZY X and Z you're listening to, listener-supported community radio here in Philo. We have Eliot Coleman on the line discussing the connections in the organic movement over the last 100 and 150 years. And I'd like to open up the lines, I guess. If anyone wants to join our conversation, you can phone in here at 895-2448 or 1-800-499-7117, and we'll put you on the air, too, and we'll talk some more.
What countries do you feel, Eliot, represent kind of the leading edge of organic farming? That is, those who haven't thrown out the philosophy
like we're doing
for a more commercial system. I know that you travel around quite a bit, and talking about agriculture and is your passion. And
when I first went to Europe in 1974, it blew me away how good the organic farmers were over there, how much better they were than anything I'd seen around in the States at that time. And it was the French, the Germans, and the Swiss who I thought were the very best at that time. The Dutch have since gotten into it, as they will in anything horticultural, because they're so skilled at horticulture. And there is a difference between the approaches over there. With the Dutch, it's fairly business-like. With the Swiss and Germans, it's very organized. With the French, it's essentially poetic, and I have to admit that the poetry of farming always appeals to me as much as anything. So some of the finest organic vegetable growers and field growers I think I've seen were in France, and they were doing just a beautiful job. They were focusing on production from the point of view of yield, but as with the French in anything, food involved, the quality of the produce was most important to them. Scientifically, the best work is probably coming out of Germany and maybe second Switzerland. I think a lot of American researchers in this, even though they are supposed to have learned a second language for their PhD, never really have, and would benefit if they had, because there's a lot of good German research that never gets translated. There's a lot of good Dutch research, too, I suppose, that never gets translated, and since the Dutch have gotten into this so well, that would be another good place to look. But the interesting thing over the years, and even back then, I never limited my visits just to organic farms. I would visit any farmer who I thought looked like he or she knew what they were doing.
Sure.
And, boy, I tell you, there's some wonderful ideas to pick up from the small-scale conventional growers in Europe, because the European small-scale conventional growers never got quite as maniacally into chemicals as we did over here. I can remember being in Europe in 1979. I set up a tour for the USDA group that was studying organic agriculture at that point, and we went to a farm in Switzerland that was running comparative trials, and they had their conventional, they had their organic, and their biodynamic. And after the differences in the techniques being used on these three sections were explained to the USDA specialists, one of them turned to me and he said, "So that's Swiss conventional. If somebody told me that in the U.S., I would have thought that was organic." So I think that there has always been a far greater understanding of the limits to which one can push the soil over in Europe, because unlike us, you couldn't just dump that farm you just ruined and go clear another one 100 miles to the west, because that sort of opportunity didn't exist there.
And now we can't do that.
And now we can't do that, so now we better learn to take better care of the soil we have.
Yeah, we got a caller, so shall we let him on?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, caller, you're on the air, I hope.
Yes.
Good. I
I
gotcha.
have two questions, and I'll just listen on the air after I ask them. The first is, where is the Good Life Center located, and are there times of the year or times of the day, and what times can you go and visit it? And the other one is about the book written in 1964. Who's the author, and what's the title?
Strum Hunter. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Good Life Center is in Harborside, Maine. And its hours are in the summer every day except Monday from 1 to 5 in the afternoon, I believe. That gives the caretakers enough time in the morning to get their work done.
Is that right next to you then?
That's just a half mile down the road. Yeah, the land we're on is land that was originally part of Helen and Scott's 140 acres that they bought.
Right.
And the book from 1964 I mentioned by Beatrice Trum Hunter is titled Gardening Without Poisons. And for the time she wrote it, I thought it was really one of the best. It's well-researched. She was a very competent writer and investigator of new ideas. There's also another neat book from the old days by a gentleman named Leonard Wickenden. Now, this one was printed in 1950, and it's entitled Make Friends with Your Land. And it's just a little thing. It's an introduction to the ideas of organic by a gentleman who was a retired chemist, who retired to his place in Connecticut and got thoroughly into gardening. And his first, as a chemist, was very skeptical of all the organic claims. And then as he gardened more, he found out they were entirely right. And so he put his scientific mind to finding out what was going on. And it is really hard to realize that this book was written 50 years ago, given the prejudice we have today against old ideas. Well, these are certainly not old ideas.
Right.
this book was as together and as up to date as almost anything you could find written today, and yet it was written 50 years ago.
Yeah, that one's pretty hard to find. I found a copy of Soils and Men, which I've ordered, so me and Dan will have a look at that soon.
If we consider that maybe between 1920 and 1970 was the incubation period where a lot of great ideas were written down and formalized, Sir Albert Howard and Rudolf Steiner.
What year was Howard's book, by the way? I'm
Howard's book, An Agricultural Testament, was 1938.
Okay.
But he had one before that he wrote with an Indian researcher who was a colleague at the center that he ran in India, and this one was called The Waste Products of Agriculture, and that came out in 1931. So he was heavily involved in the concept of natural fertilization as far back as that.
And wastes were a huge problem there in India, where he was, working with sisal farmers and fiber crop farmers that were feeding the Industrial Revolution, and they would have a crop that was mostly a waste product, and it would just end up clogging their water systems and things like that. They needed to find some way to compost that and use it.
Did he work on doing that, Albert Howard?
That was what began all the trials into what is now called the indoor system of composting. INDORE was the name of the town where he was working.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that.
But I tell you, there's an even more fascinating person if you want to go back even further. Cyril Hopkins, Hopkins, was the director of the Illinois State Experiment Station between about 1913 and 1918. And Cyril wrote a book called Soil Fertility and Permanent Agriculture. And Cyril, back then, was just absolutely straightforward. He said, you don't need to buy nitrogen fertilizer. You got tons of nitrogen over every acre of your farm up in the air. What you need to do is grow clovers and take it out of the air. And you don't need to buy potassium fertilizers. There's so and so many 1,000 pounds of potassium in every acre furrow slice on your farm. All you have to do is use intelligent systems and make it available.
Don't
and
need no
basically, the only two
fertilizer?
fertilizers Cyril Hopkins suggested you buy were lime if your soil was acid, and phosphate rock to make sure you had enough phosphorus. And he railed up and down against the new tendency to sell farmers everything that they didn't need in some pre-prepared form. And this was a guy, as I said, who was the director of the Illinois Agriculture Experiment Station for 6 years. So there were people who, long before the word organic became current, and who probably never would have identified themselves with an odd group of people who seemed to be doing things differently, who shared the same ideas, but were expressing them in conventional concepts.
And what do you think it was that really made the organic movement take off in the 70s and certification programs start up? Was it the Back to the Land movement? Was it Silent Spring? Was it a whole bunch of different factors?
Well, I suspect Silent Spring helped an awful lot. But once people started gardening and farming that way, they found out it worked.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of one of these things where you've been told that this isn't going to work out, and then you try it and it does. And then you try it even further and it works even better. I think that was the thing that got to most people. And then all of a sudden, food is being produced this way. People are interested because of Silent Spring. And not only that, my gosh, everybody seemed to agree it tasted better. Now, that could have merely been because it was fresher, because the grower was next door rather than 2,000 miles away. But all of those things had an effect. I mean, I can remember all sorts of examples from our own farm years ago. People coming back in and telling us that they'd never tasted carrots or potatoes, that had the sort of flavor ours did. Now, I didn't think that had anything to do with freshness, because those are two crops that are always stored. And yet, these are customers who just suddenly said, wow, isn't that amazing how much better that tastes?
Yeah, my little story would be John Jeevan's How to Grow More Vegetables, because I always had a little plot going on in the back and of something or other, and that just sort of gave me the boost I needed to really take it seriously. And yeah, it tasted better, and started making my own compost. So that was back in about 1970, I'd say, 71.
And we have chefs to thank as well.
Oh, I think we have Alice Waters to thank more than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a grower, I look upon Alice as the person who suggested to the world that vegetable growers were wonderful people and noble people and doing great work. I don't think that had been suggested by anybody before, but it was certainly a nice thought.
Yeah, no, she's done a heck of a lot to boost everything along. I'm going to be talking to some apple growers in a few weeks too, and I saw the attitude when I was there last time. I was not asked to speak. That they just think that's just nuts. That she's willing to pay all this money. I mean, they're hurting themselves when they don't think their product's worth anything. And I'm gonna try to read that out loud to them. I mean, she really appreciates it, and that's what you need if you're going to stay small and get a market. So yeah, well.
Oh, absolutely.
But they think it's silly. I mean, and they're the guys growing this stuff. And then Alice Waters came here and gave me $40 a box, and I go, good.
Yeah,
but they
isn't
think
that
it's
wonderful?
Nuts. They think it's nuts.
Well, no, it's somebody who appreciates the way quality should be. I mean, we often say when people ask us, since we're growing in winter, about the competition from produce shipped in from elsewhere, we usually say, we don't compete with those people. We're growing a totally different product.
Right.
They're producing bulk commodities. We're producing finely crafted, exceptionally flavorful food. Yeah, if you're doing it right, there's no competition except with yourself trying to do it better next year.
But could you see in agriculture, a large-scale agriculture like we have, that still is based on a lot of these principles and the philosophy of farming as a biological system rather than some industrial activity?
Parts of it will come down and parts of it won't. The parts that fit in with the industrial mindset will eventually be accepted. That's why my friend's term neo-conventional is probably fairly accurate as to what we're heading toward.
Mm-hmm.
But in every area like this, you have a few people out pushing the edges of the exceptional. And, yeah, there'll always be some of us. Somehow, though, the attitude of most people for the amount of work and effort they want to put into their life has been changed to the point where they'd rather not put in that much work and effort, and so they're willing to settle for stuff that isn't as exquisite as it could be. Us oddballs who take our joy in producing the exquisite will continue to produce it, even though, golly, as anybody would tell you, if you can earn $1,000 as a small farmer, you could earn $2,000 doing almost anything else.
Yeah, so true.
And how about in terms of if you could make, wave some magic wand and have an organic farming department underneath your supervision, what would you have them be studying? What don't we know that you think, what are the new frontiers of organics that you think really deserve a lot of research and support?
Well, there's two answers to that. My new frontiers are merely getting people to understand that the natural world is in control and you can't mess around with its laws too much without getting into trouble. The other answer to it is as organics moves back more toward neo-conventional, there is going to be a search for miracle treatments, silver bullets that still sort of qualify under the quote organic unquote concept, but allow you to do the things that you could do before with pesticides and soluble fertilizers. That's where people would probably like to see the research. As far as the research on the way I do it, boy, I think it all exists. I think if somebody wanted to take 2 or 3 years and go around the world and visit all the best organic growers and put together their best ideas on a crop-by-crop basis of what they're doing, they would find that most of these concepts are known today. They're exceptionally sound. The best growers are getting yields that are equal or better to the best yields with chemicals, and that the information is there. It's just there doesn't seem to be any method to get it from one farmer to another. But the ideas are known. This is there's too many good growers. I mean, that's where the university researchers really miss out. I mean, to them, anything that's going on this or any other organic farm, no matter how many years we've been doing it and how successful we are, is merely anecdotal evidence. But they're not going to accept it until they go out and do some little
they're really missing the boat on
trial with it. But what they don't realize is there are an awful lot of farmers out there, and they're all dang intelligent people, and they're all working very hard to make a living, and they all know an awful lot about what they're doing. They'd sure like to know a lot more about things, but that's where I think they would find that the best source of that information is other farmers.
They have this little God thing or whatever. They're going to do it on their test plots, They're going to fool around with it, IPM on their test plots, and not get out there and really report back what's going on.
Don't you think there might be a danger in those farmers passing on without us really getting their wisdom collected?
I would love to see it expanded there. I would just like to collect it and put it in the common mind.
Yeah, I have another call. Somebody was trying earlier and then gave up too soon. Okay. Hi, caller, you're on the air.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that at the beginning of your show, you were talking about we're going to now talk about the origins of organic farming, and I thought, oh, wow, that's about 19,000 years, or actually a little more than 19,000 years worth of organic farming's gone on.
I try to narrow it down to
that's
the 20th
century. That's quite a
century.
lot to talk about and a lot of history to cover.
Isn't the subtitle of Wickenden's book Farmers of 40 Centuries, I think?
Not the subtitle, but
caller.
the title of F.H. King's book.
F.H. King. Oh, okay.
No, the caller is entirely right. The way all food was grown up until the mid 1800s was with these same techniques. What has happened is merely a better understanding of what is going on. People knew back then that legumes seemed to benefit a following crop, but it wasn't until the later part of the 19th century that people understood what was going on with legumes and their symbiosis with the bacteria that got nitrogen from the air and so forth. That knowledge today probably allows me to use them more effectively, or knowledge of green manures that wouldn't have been known to me 200 years ago allows me to possibly run a more effective crop rotation. But no, the caller is 100% right. These are old ideas. I have a wonderful book on my shelf entitled Roman Farming.
Yeah.
Right.
And by golly, I mean, those guys were so good. If you asked them what the best fertilizer was for one thing or another, they had it right down. And on this crop, you want to use horse manure, and this sheep manure, and the very finest, if you wanted to grow cucumbers for Nero or whatever, was pigeon manure from your dovecote.
What you got to do is observe. I'll have another call. Hi, caller. You're on the air.
Hi. I had two questions for Eliot. One was, you were talking about humus before, and you were talking about India. And I was wondering about human waste used for compost or manure. Is there a possibility of that? And the other question was, there's a little red and black beetle that loves to eat tomatoes and sort of ruins tomatoes during tomato growing season. I was wondering is there any non-chemical way of controlling that little beetle? And those are the two questions.
Okay, thanks.
I'll take my call off the air then.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, two interesting questions. Human manure was obviously a major input to soil fertility for many years. The term night soil is used to refer to it, and it has one main problem. As a vegetable grower, you would never want to announce that you were using it because I'm quite sure it would make your customers nervous. But F.H. King, in that book you mentioned, Farmers of 40 Centuries, gives examples of farmers building an outhouse out on the road next to their farm to encourage passers-by to leave them some extra fertilizer. It was that popular. And yet there's a book that came out, probably 30 or 40 years after King's book, which was entitled Health and Agriculture in China, which suggests that because of the excessive use of human wastes carelessly composted, the Chinese at the time had high incidence of intestinal parasites. And I remember an article in the New York Times in the 1970s where the Koreans had this same problem because they'd always used a lot of human wastes in vegetable growing. And the Korean government was now starting a certification program for special farms. This is very amusing. That would guarantee you that the food was only grown with chemical fertilizers. So you could be sure that there were going to be no intestinal parasites on it. Human beings are a very amusing species, and we do very amusing things. The answer to the second question, if the questioner was asking about the Colorado potato beetle, was that what I didn't quite hear that.
You said it was red and black. I'm not familiar with it. I haven't seen that one.
But he did say potatoes and tomatoes.
Tomatoes.
He said tomatoes.
Tomatoes. Yeah. Then again, the callers in California, and I'm in Maine, and you guys may have fascinating insects out there that I don't know. But if it is the potato beetle, there is a form of BT that is been used reasonably successfully against the potato beetle. Depending on how big his home garden potato patch is, you can have a great success out there with a shop vacuum on an extension cord. If the numbers are beyond hand picking, and better than that, we have found that the cause, and as I said earlier, my attitude is always to figure out how to correct the cause. The cause of most pest problems is the plant is under stress, and the two stresses on potatoes and similarly tomatoes that make them susceptible to pests are fluctuating moisture levels, and especially with potatoes, the soil being too warm, that wouldn't affect tomatoes. And we found that planting potatoes normally, and then the minute they pop ground, mulching them with about 8 inches of straw between the rows makes an enormous difference and can cut your Colorado potato beetle problem down by about 90%. We haven't figured out what the answer to the last 10% is, but give us a few more years.
If only 10% left, you can hand pick them. Well, we're darn near the end. We got about 2 minutes left. I don't know if we can make a wrap here. I think there's sort of an underlying thing we've kind of been saying. We're not real happy having the feds getting involved in the organic game and maybe another bite out of the soul, the organic movement a little bit. But the real people are going to keep on keeping on anyway.
Oh, yeah, no, we'll end up with a new term.
Yeah, you see that?
Soon.
I do too.
Maybe I'll start calling it affirmative agriculture because it's always bothered me that organic is always defined by what you don't do. We don't use this and you don't use that.
Yeah, that's not a good attitude.
I would start something called affirmative agriculture, which is defined by what we do. We use compost and we aim to create the most nutritious crops possible, and so on and so on.
I think that the customer also is going to have to take a lot of responsibility for, I mean, certification by familiarity rather than some program.
The old saying, Dan, was the best way to know the quality of the food you're eating is to know the first name of the grower.
Yeah.
There's your familiarity.
I try to work on some proposals to that effect. That those direct-to-market people ought to be kind of, less impacted by these overloading of rules and fees. They got their own certification going on. If their farm's open to their buyers, and they know them down at the market and they shake hands.
Yes.
That's good enough,
Absolutely.
So what is all this other stuff? Those guys are gonna be finding another name. They're just gonna say, forget this. This is nuts. Okay.
I think it's also maybe you can just mention the names of your two most popular books, Eliot. I think some people might not have them and could benefit quite a bit from them.
Well, a lot of the ideas I'm expressing now, I express in both of them. The first was called The New Organic Grower, and the second was called Fourth Season Harvest. And you can get them through your local bookstore, and thank you for allowing me to make a plug for myself.
No, they're both excellent, as well as your extended season.
Oh, the Winter Harvest Manual. Yeah, that
winter.
one you have to buy directly from us here at Four Season Farm in Harborside, Maine.
And we've had a whole show on that before, but I think anybody interested in organic farming should check Eliot's work out.
Okay, I have to thank you, Eliot. We got the next DJ here ready to go, so we have to sign off. And man, thanks for pulling our fat out of the fire here in the last minute. It's been another fast hour, just ripped on by.
You're welcome, Tim and Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.